Well, it's wonderful to be with you. It seems like March 20, was it? 20, was it? It feels like a lifetime ago. And we had a lot planned, going into that spring, many of us, and everything got changed. And this is the first time I have actually traveled and spoken somewhere since the start of the pandemic. So this is a special sort of debut, re-beginning with you. So thank you for being on this journey together with each other and with me. I want to also thank all the people that are joining us online as well. It's good to have you connected with us here. So when Rob Reimer asked me to speak, I asked him about a potential topic. And President Reimer said, I want you to speak on something that you have never spoken on before. It's true. And he said, preferably, it will come from a new book that you're about to write, but it hasn't been published. And so I was projecting to write a book over the pandemic, not about the coronavirus, but about another theme altogether that deals with shame. And I was explaining to Leighton and Glenda Friesen and Cameron over dinner the concept of this new book. I have found that as I have interacted with people, not just those who have been abused and traumatized, but people who are very successful in a worldly sense, that almost everyone struggles with a sense of not being quite enough. They might not call it shame, but a sense that they've got to do a little bit more or a lot more so that they can feel like their existence is validated. And many of you would be familiar with the work of the shame researcher Brené Brown. Her work has struck a chord with many people. But even though she is, as I understand it, a committed Christian, for the most part, she doesn't present God as the answer to the problem of shame. And so I wanted to explore the theme of how a deep experience of God's delight and love and grace can transform our experience, not only of shame, but the way we walk through the world. And so I don't have any sort of polished lectures. It would have been a lot smoother if I came here talking about something that I've talked about before, but the material this weekend will be brand new, and I'm happy to do it in Manitoba. I'd be nervous maybe in a more hostile context. But, I think that Manitobans are some of the finest people, not only in Canada, but in the world. I've loved everyone that I've ever met from Manitoba, and we've had a number of them come through our church in Vancouver. And if you're familiar with the city of Vancouver, our family lives equidistant between Main Street and Cambie Street, so pretty central in the city, on West 20th Avenue and Manitoba Street. So every single day, I'm thinking of Manitoba. It's coming literally to my mind and heart, and I love the people of Manitoba. It is wonderful to be with you. Rob, thanks for the invitation. I believe that you're viewing this from home, and we hope and pray that you'll receive a speedy healing and recovery. I want to thank Laura for her organizing a lot of the details behind the scenes. I want to thank Dave Reimer for stepping in and becoming the de facto host of the conference. I also want to thank Arlene, one of your professors, Arlene Friesen, and Jacob, for picking me up and taking me out to a late lunch for you guys and sort of an early lunch for me today, if you consider the time change. So tonight, I want to talk about how the grace of God can cover us in our experience of shame. Tomorrow morning, God willing, I'm going to discuss how we experience the delight of God in a unique way through other people, through one another. And then I'll talk about the gift of limits, how embracing our limits can actually help us reach our potential and overcome shame. And then in the final session, I will talk about how awakening to beauty, the beauty of the world, the beauty of the things God brings into our life, can help us experience freedom from our self-absorption and self-preoccupation, anxiety, and open up in beautiful new ways as we experience God's grace woven into the world. And so, again, I don't have a super polished lecture, but these are some ideas. There's a Q&A afterwards. Would invite you to participate. And so you're the first group that has ever heard some of the ideas that I've been mulling and trying to put down on paper, so to speak. So thank you for being here and for being part of this. We would invite your pushback, feedback afterwards, including your questions, including those of you who are joining us online. When I was in junior high school, so I'm in grade 8, it was really important for me to somehow make it into sort of the popular crowd of the bad boy athletes. I tried really hard and eventually made it in, though just barely. And there was this popular football player, a linebacker at our school named Charlie, and I really wanted to impress him by showing him just how easy it was to shoplift. So I took my friend Charlie to a store called Kmart. Do you have Kmart in Manitoba? You have Walmart, right? So it's a slightly smaller version of Walmart. And so we go into Kmart and we head over to the sporting goods section. And I reach out for a baseball batting glove and I slide it into my jacket pocket. I've got a Vancouver Canucks hockey jacket where the pockets have sort of holes in the liner so I can slide stuff in between the jacket and the liner. So I steal it, sort of push it to the back of my jacket. And then I reach out for a black rubber ball and I squeeze it in my hand so it's not very visible, slip it into my other pocket. And I end up stealing a bunch of stuff, including stuff that I do not need, like earrings. My ears are not pierced. No girlfriend, and so I'm just really showing off to Charlie, showing him how easy it is. And I step out of Kmart, and a few moments later, someone taps me on the shoulder. I turn around, and the person says, "I'm the store detective. Come with me." And I look at my friend Charlie, who's wide-eyed, and he simply says, "See you later." So he takes off, naturally. My parents call me, or the detective calls my parents, and then my parents come to Kmart. They pick me up, they take me home, and they lead me into my room, and they force me to kneel in the traditional Asian style. So maybe you can imagine this if you've never done this yourself. So you're sort of kneeling, and it was very painful for me. Then as now, I've never been flexible. And my mother is crying, and my dad strikes me a couple of times, which I know is very bad form, especially if you're Mennonite, right? Because I know you love peace, and we need your prayers and voice, especially with what's happening in Ukraine. But I don't mean to sort of diss my dad. This was very common practice among Japanese fathers and immigrant fathers in Canada at the time, so I needed it. It was good for me. And I had been on the receiving end of his discipline before, but I had never felt his anger with so much intensity. And as I said, my mom's crying, and my dad explained to me that by stealing, I had not only done something wrong, but I had brought shame on our entire family. And it felt just very heavy and very enlightening at the same time. And afterwards, I remember standing at the top of the stairs in our home, and I'm not a Christian at the time, not a follower of Jesus, but I remember thinking, I never want to do anything ever that will bring this much pain to my parents. I need to find a new way of life. And it was some months later, my dad had taken me on a field trip to a local prison and later said, "I just wanted you to see your future home courtesy of my tax dollars." It didn't scare me straight. And my dad, who had been raised a nominal Buddhist in Japan, he himself had recently become a follower of Jesus. So he took me to a Christian youth conference, and I heard for the first time that Christ died on the cross for my sins and that I could have a new beginning, a new slate. I didn't understand all the theology, but I knew I needed a new direction in my life, so I gave my life to Christ. There is such a thing called state shame, and there is such a thing called trait shame. State shame versus trait shame. So state shame is the temporary feeling of shame that we can have that can be redemptive. I felt like I was experiencing some redemptive state shame when my parents corrected me, rebuked me, told me what I had done to them, to me. That was healthy. The theologian Lewis Meads writes, "A healthy sense of shame is perhaps the surest sign of our divine origin and human dignity. When we feel this sense of shame, we are feeling a nudge from our true selves." And so that's a healthy kind of shame. State shame is a nudge from our true selves, which is of divine origin, what some people might call the best and the most real part of us, the image of God self that we inhabit. But feeling trait shame, a more permanent kind of shame, where we start to take on an identity where we feel that we are fundamentally flawed and unlovable, is toxic and destructive. Now, healthy shame can act like a proximity sensor on your car. Have you driven with one of those? Do you have one of those? I don't have one on my car, but I've had them on rentals. And so when you veer too close to an object, it starts to beep. And so state shame can act like a proximity sensor. Healthy shame can help us realize that we have veered away from our divine origin, and I just veered off the camera, I think, and signal to us that God has a better intention for us. Now, in the beginning, we were created as human beings in the image of God. And before we experienced, quote, original sin as a humanity, we experienced original glory. And if toxic shame is an emotion that we feel when we have veered off of the road of God's good intention for us, then before sin came into the world, shame, that is toxic shame, was not an emotion that we human beings felt at all. Now, it's interesting, in the book of Genesis, we read that the first human beings, Adam and Eve, were, as you know, naked and unashamed. And as you know, as Bible college students, pastors, people who are of the Word, that referred not only to a physical nakedness, but also a psychological and spiritual openness with each other. And we've yearned for that condition ever since. And then what happens? Sin and shame enter their story and ours. Listen to the phrasing from Scripture, from Genesis. We read that Adam and Eve were both naked and they felt no shame. So this very language suggests that this new emotion of shame is about to enter their story, because the writer could have written, Adam and Eve were naked and they were happy. Adam and Eve were naked, if they wanted to contextualize it, and they weren't cold because it wasn't minus 22 Celsius, with a wind chill factor of feeling like minus 36 Celsius. Or the author could have written, they were naked and feeling at home with themselves. But no, the writer pens the words, they were naked and without shame, as though he was suggesting, or whoever wrote this was suggesting, that shame was about to enter their story. And then, as you know, Satan enters into the Garden of Eden in the form of what? A serpent. And when we think of the word serpent, maybe we imagine a hideous creature slithering on its belly. But according to some Bible scholars, before the serpent was cursed, the serpent may well have been the most dazzlingly beautiful creature in all of Eden. Satan, as we know from the Bible, was once an angel of light who apparently didn't feel quite enough, so he aspired to be like God. And the one who doesn't feel like quite enough approaches Adam and Eve and insinuates, "You are not quite enough. You can be so much more. You can become like God, knowing good from evil. You can be fulfilled and free if you will just eat of the one tree that God has forbidden you to eat from. You can be so much more. You can know life in all its fullness." And Adam and Eve bite literally and figuratively, and something drops for them. Do they feel suddenly the best version of themselves? Do they feel fuller and freer? Do they feel like God? No, they feel like something has been taken from them, and they experience an emotion that they've never felt before: shame. And because they feel like something has been taken from them, something is missing, they reach for what? For fig leaves. And they seek to cover themselves. And when we turn away from the source of all love, all beauty, all joy, all goodness, all truth, we do not become more, we become less. And we turn from God, and even as we're turning, we feel an emptiness. We feel like something is being taken from us. And so, even as we're turning away from God, we at the same time, at some level, feel a longing to connect and to belong. We yearn for someone who will be in our life, who will say, in effect, despite your shame, I am here and I am not going anywhere. And like Adam and Eve, shame makes us feel vulnerable in a bad sort of way and exposed. It causes us, as Leighton and Glenda and Cameron and I were talking about over dinner, to avert our eyes, to look down and away, to curl in and make ourselves small, or to try to make ourselves big as a way to compensate for the way we're feeling diminished. And all of us at some level, even those of us who are followers of Jesus, have a tendency to reach for fig leaves to try and cover ourselves in some way. And so for some of us, we overwork. Before entering into vocational pastoral work, I was what they called a 7-Eleven man in Tokyo. Do you know that expression? 7-Eleven man, do you know what it actually means? It's not referring to someone who drinks a lot of Slurpees, although 7-Eleven is pretty big in terms of the convenience store in Japan too. It refers to someone whose workday goes from 7 in the morning till 11 at night. So that was my workday, so it was pretty crazy. But I'm telling you, Japanese businessmen and women work long hours not only to try and demonstrate their loyalty to the company, but also so as to be seen as dutiful and really hardworking, because they're very concerned in a shame and honor culture as to how they are viewed by others. Some of us will use some kind of hobby or interest in our lives that we are seeking to excel at as a way to cover ourselves. So when I was younger, in my elementary, junior high, and high school years, I loved competitive sports. But I especially liked the informal games of hockey and football that I played with my friends on the cul-de-sac in front of our home. But when I reached high school, sports became a way for me to try to cultivate an identity. So it wasn't just about sport, which I liked, but it was also about trying to win the respect of my peers and trying to gain the attention of girls who would otherwise never notice me. For others, they try to cover themselves with fig leaves of being smarter or better educated. So I have a friend who is brilliant. He's someone who attended some prestigious universities. He is a creative leader in his professional field. And he was telling me that when he was in junior high school, he was bullied. He was bullied because he went to a school where sports were valued above all else, and he was not athletic. And so he would hide from his peers at recess and during lunch hour, and then he would sort of imaginatively gaze toward his classmates, and he would say, "But I'm smarter than you. I'm smarter than you, but I am smarter than you are." Some of us, it's close to home for some of us, use ministry involvement as a way to compensate. I wish I could say that I serve as a pastor solely for the glory of God. But if I'm honest with myself, it's also a way, if I'm hoping to excel in it in some way, that I can somehow validate my existence. I mean, coming here and presenting, I think I'm a pretty relaxed person by nature, but I'm a little bit nervous because this is brand new material that I've never, quote, rehearsed before. So there's a kind of way in which we can use ministry as a way to cover ourselves, or becoming religiously or morally OCD, obsessively compulsive. We can try to curate a cut, sculpted body, or we can try to curate a particular image on social media, or raise accomplished kids as a way to cover ourselves. Or we can try, as I've said, to be more athletic or more musical, or smarter or better educated, or thinner or beefier, or whatever, amass more money, more pleasures, more experiences, more travel, as a way to give ourselves a sense of cover. But all of these things will prove to be flimsy garments that will not fully and adequately cover our sense of shame. They will not give us the lasting confidence and contentment that we so deeply yearn for. The Trappist monk Thomas Merton observed that we try to clothe our invisible, non-existent self with achievements, novel experiences, pleasures, material possessions. And we use these things to cover ourselves with bandages so that our non-existent, invisible being seems visible. And Thomas Merton describes this self, this visible self that we try to construct with our accomplishments, with what we do and what we have, as our false self. But the problem with our false self is that It's not us. I have a friend who is a gifted actor, and he's told me that whether he's on a movie set, a stage, in an interview setting, or an everyday social, situation, he can put on a certain persona. He can play the brash and uber-confident man. Or he can play the deferential, solicitous, eager to please person. He can play the role of the charming flirt or the shy, nervous misfit. Whatever is needed, he can play. Thomas Merton says the problem with the false self is that the false self cannot actually experience the love of God. Merton says, God does not even know the false self, so God cannot love our false self. And then Merton says, and to be unknown by God is just way too much privacy. Way too much privacy. So how do we become vulnerable in the best sense? Open and free. How do we live from the deep center of our true self? How do we become like a healthy and free child who has not yet learned to wear the raincoat of shame that repels the grace of God? How do we, in the words of Ian Cron, become who we were before the world told us who we were supposed to be? How do we become, in the words of the poet May Sarton, people who can say, now I become myself? It's taken time, many years and places. I've been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces, but now I become myself. How do we learn to re-inhabit, or perhaps it feels like inhabiting for the first time, our true self, which alone provides through God's grace a covering that can protect us from the storms of life? I'm a very absent-minded person. I tend to misplace things a lot. Cell phone, keys, passport, etc. So on my phone, which I've left in your office, President Rob Reimer, on the back, if you'll see a label that says, if found, text Ken at ken@10th.ca. And then I've got my wife's cell phone number on the back. So, and it actually came in handy the other day when I was walking our dog Sasha on the beach. I accidentally dropped it. Someone called me. So don't say you didn't get anything out of this talk, because there's some news you can use. Okay, what was my point? My point was, or is, that when we lose something, isn't it true that we try to think back to our last memory of having had our phone or our keys or whatever, our wallet? And when we think about our true self, living from our deep, authentic center, our image of God self, where was the last time we had it? As a human race, we had it when we were in Eden, walking in intimacy with God in the cool of the day. And it's as we re-experience walking with God, deep intimacy, that we can start to live without shame. When the light of God's love begins to shine in the diamond of our true self, we become vulnerable, beautiful, open, and free. When we live from our deep center, our true, made in the image of God's self, we are able by God's grace, to overcome the shame that binds us. You know, when Adam and Eve turned away from God, God calls out for them, asking the question, "Where are you?" Now, I know that some preachers apparently interpret this as a "Where are you?" as a scolding, as a reprimand, as a rebuke. But we know from what follows that God's "Where are you?" is really a bid for intimate connection. How do we know that? We know that because when Adam and Eve turn away from God, as I mentioned, they realize they are naked. They sew fig leaves for themselves as garments, but they prove to be flimsy and inadequate. We actually have a fig tree in our backyard. Yes, at the corner. If you ever are in Vancouver in the late summer, just remember your province, Manitoba. And if you can remember the number 20, just reach up over our fence and they'll be hanging there for you to pick around late August, early September. And so I've done my fair share of picking figs, pruning, and when I come into inadvertent contact with fig leaves, you know what happens? It leaves my skin feeling sticky and itchy, and then I break out in a little rash. So I would not recommend, here's another useful piece of information, do not try to make clothing from fig leaves. No t-shirts, no pants, no hoodie, no suit, okay? No nothing, okay? It's just a bad idea. And Adam and Eve will realize that, and God realizes that. And so according to Genesis 3:21, God creates garments of skin for Adam and his wife Eve and clothes them. The Franciscan priest Richard Rohr says we see God here as the nurturing seamstress who sews garments for Adam and Eve that are much more durable than fig leaves. God warms the first human beings, not just physically. They feel like it's about minus 22 spiritually, 22 Celsius. But he also warms them metaphysically through these garments. Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, writes in his commentary on Genesis, God does for the couple what they could not do for themselves. They cannot deal with their shame, but God can, will, and does. That's good, isn't it? And to get those first animal skins, God would have had to sacrifice an animal. And as you may know, when an animal is sacrificed, though we don't know the nature of the sacrifice, we don't know exactly what kind of animal it was, we do know that this is the very first death in the universe, as far as in our world, as far as we know, recorded at least in Scripture. And while we don't know the nature of the sacrifice itself, we don't know the specific animal that was offered up, we do know that it foreshadows the great sacrifice that God would make on our behalf millennia later when God becomes a human being in Jesus Christ. And roughly at around age 33, he bears in his body not only our sin, which is often emphasized by theologians and preachers in the West, but also our shame. Being crucified was the ultimate shaming experience. Jesus was stripped naked. He was savagely beaten. He was spat upon. A mock crown of thorns was driven into his head. And then he was placed completely buck naked on a cross, no loincloth. And in all likelihood, he wasn't feet above the ground. He was a few centimeters or inches above the ground. It was the ultimate shaming experience. And on the cross, according to Hebrews 12:2, Jesus endured the cross despising the shame. On the cross, he not only carried our sin, but he bore our shame so that we might not bear it any longer, so that we don't need to hobble under its weight. And according to Hebrews 13:8, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And the unchanging God of the universe, who continued to seek after Adam and Eve, even after they had turned away, continues to seek you and me, because he is making a bid for restoration, for healed relationship, for intimacy, for life together. Now, I love what Kurt Thompson says. We are looking for someone who is looking for us. We are looking for someone who is looking for us. And the one we are looking for, whether we know it or not, is also looking for us. Well, I was raised primarily in North America. I'm originally from Japan. I was born there, which is, as I mentioned earlier, the quintessential shame and honor society. And in Japan, a person experiences shame when they fail to behave in a way that is considered appropriate by others. And so shame, and some of us were discussing this earlier, is a little different from guilt, because when we do something wrong, we break a principle, we may violate our conscience and feel a sense we've done something wrong. That's a feeling of guilt. But shame has a profound relational aspect. Shame makes me feel like I am diminished in someone else's eyes, maybe the eyes of the community, my family, God, my own eyes. And in Japanese society, one of the ways that shame can be removed from a family or a community is by a person committing something called harikiri, seppuku, which is a ritual form of honor suicide. Now, I know that in the West, suicide is seen as a kind of escape, in some cases a cowardly escape from the painful reality of life. But in Japan, in the shame and honor culture, it is seen as an act of taking responsibility for others, where a person says, shame has befallen my family or community. I will take the shame upon myself by taking my life, so that shame can be erased from my family, so that honor can be restored, so that relationships can be healed. Please don't misunderstand me. If you're going through a difficult time and you're thinking about maybe it'd be easier if I weren't around, I am in no way, absolutely no way, encouraging death by suicide. I just want to be categorically clear about it. I'm just saying that in shame and honor societies like Japan, shame is a way for someone to remove the shame for someone else. And when Jesus Christ died on the cross, he was not only paying the penalty for our sins, not only paying our moral debts before God, but in a mysterious way, he was also bearing in his very being our shame, so that that shame would fall off our shoulders, fall off our back, so we wouldn't hobble beneath its weight, so that we could live completely without shame before our Maker. And if we can live without shame before our Maker, we can live with less shame in our own eyes and before others as well. You know, no matter what you've done, I'm thinking of a Mennonite pastor of mine, friend, colleague, who's had a big shame reveal, and we've been in touch. And so no matter what you've done, no matter what secret sin you might have harbored, Or maybe it's something relatively small in the whole scheme of things. I hope that you know from the depth of your being that God wants to clothe you with garments of glory and honor. I hope that you know that God wants to do for you what the warm days of spring will do for the flowers. Do you have cherry trees here in Manitoba that blossom? Yeah, one day, right? One day in faith you believe that the warm days of spring are coming. And what the warm days of spring will do for those cherry trees, God's grace will also do for you. I hope and pray that like a wild animal who feels safe in the quietness of the bushes and the wilderness, that when you experience the profound and unconditional grace of God, you will feel free in your soul to come out of hiding and to be who you really are and all that God intended you to be. I've got a dear friend who shared a story with me. He's also shared this story in a somewhat public context, so it's okay with my sharing this. It's okay with my sharing this. But he grew up in a very conservative Christian home, very strict in some ways, and his parents were complete teetotalers. So they never, to this day, his parents have never drunk a drop of alcohol. So this is how my friend was raised. And as he became a young adult, he occasionally learned to enjoy a glass of wine and maybe a beer with buddies. And then he had a friend of his come to visit him in our city of Vancouver, and his friend wanted to go out to a pub in the downtown area of Vancouver, so they went out and they had a few beers together. No big deal, in my opinion. And so they left the pub, and they're walking down a street in Vancouver, and they pass another pub, and his buddy says, "Hey, how about just one more beer?" So they walk into the pub, and my friend says, "Oh, I just sort of blank out from there. I don't remember what happened next. My next memory is of me lying flat on my back on a sidewalk in a drug-infested, fairly dangerous part of our city, and my friend is trying to hold someone back who's trying to beat me up." And then he says, I blank out again, and my next memory is I'm being dragged onto a bus by my buddy, and I'm sitting in the bus near the back, and then I get really sick and I start to throw up. I just start puking everywhere, all over this, and then the bus driver sees what's going on, pulls the bus over, it's not a bus stop, and says, "You need to get out." And then my friend says, the next memory is I'm lying in a hospital bed at VGH, connected to some IV machine, some kind of tubes, and I'm looking up at my wife. And then my friend says, some weeks later, maybe a couple of months later, I feel compelled that I need to confess this to a couple of Christian brothers. And we're in this sort of chapel area. There's a photo, or not a photo, obviously, a portrait of Jesus, which is perfect. And he says, "There's something really important I need to share with you." But he just can't bring himself to say anything. He's just in silence. He's stammering. And then, with tears running down his cheeks, he confesses his sin. His friends listen. They weep with him. They pray with him. They pray for him. And he feels this visceral wave of love that's healing. When shame had reared its ferocious head, love through his friends proved stronger yet. And so he experienced a kind of restoration and healing. I know that you're familiar with this story, but hear it again because it represents the heart of God, your God and my God. As we know in Luke 15, a Middle Eastern boy asks his father for his share of the inheritance, which, as you know, is tantamount to the son saying to his dad, "Dad, I'd be better off if you were dead." And so the father remarkably agrees, and of course, wealth is tied up in a person's land in these days, in this first century world, so he has to sell part of his property to cash out part of his estate. And in order to do that, or as a consequence of doing that, he needs to let go of certain employees, so these employees hate the younger son. The younger son takes his cash, heads off to Vegas, the equivalent of Vegas in his world, and blows his money on alcohol, drugs, and prostitutes. He runs out of money, and he ends up feeding pigs, the equivalent of selling drugs on the streets of Winnipeg, but at a pittance. He realizes how awful, how miserable, how his life just sucks. And he realizes he would be much better off as one of his father's hired servants, realizing he's no longer worthy to be called his father's son. And so he begins to walk home, rehearsing in his mind a speech about not being worthy to be called his father's son. And there is a social media network in his village called Word of Mouth Gossip. And so his fellow villagers who hate him are probably placing bets on what day he'll arrive, because rumor has it that he's making his way home. And you can be sure that they're going to be on the edge of town, ready to hurl insults and tomatoes and objects. And that may be precisely why his father every day is walking out to the edge of his estate, peering out into the distance to see if he can recognize his son, because he wants to protect him. And one day he sees his tiny silhouette way in the distance on the horizon. And as you know, he starts to sprint after him, raising the edge of his robe to run, and his legs are exposed, so he is humiliating himself. He's shaming himself in front of everyone else. And he reaches his son. And before his son can blurt out his speech about not being worthy, his father embraces him and he shouts to the servant, "Quick, bring the best robe and the best ring and put it on him." And according to Dr. Kenneth Bailey, probably the foremost scholar on parables of our time, if it was the best robe, it meant the father took off his own robe and clothed the son. If it meant the best ring, he took off his own ring and put it on his son. And then said, "Let's have a feast." And because the father, a man of stature, a man of honor, accepts his son, his honor is transferred to his son, and everyone in the village must accept him. The father absorbs the shame so his son can live unashamed. And his father removes his clothes so that his son can be clothed and covered with grace. Let's take a moment to pray together. I've been influenced by the East. I'm from the East originally, and at the end of the chapters and this forthcoming book, God willing, I'll have prayer exercises. So I invite you here in this auditorium, and if you're home or in a church community online, to participate in this as well. But breathe in deeply through your nose, and then exhale slowly. Breathe in deeply through your nose, and exhale slowly. Breathe in deeply, exhale slowly, and allow yourself to be surrounded by a sense of the Spirit. And reflect on this story from Jesus' mouth in prayerful silence. And perhaps something in this safe place that is in God's presence that sometimes makes you feel ashamed. Maybe something that your inner critic expresses, surfaces. Maybe there's some part of your life where you don't feel like you're enough. some part of yourself that you don't like or maybe even hate. Just sit with that part of you for a moment if it rises. And now, in your mind's eye, I want you to imagine, like the father in the parable, God is running toward you. That Jesus is running toward you. He's getting closer. He reaches you and he embraces you. And imagine Jesus covering you now with his robe and placing his ring on your finger. And listen to him as he wants to host a feast in your honor, and as he wants to speak words of love over you. And in your spirit, just listen for a moment as to what those words might be that he might want to speak over you. You are. You are. You are. Just savor those words if something comes. Receive that word. Receive that grace. Be covered. In the name of the Father who loves you, the Son who died for you, and the Spirit who is forever with you. Amen.